Okay, guys, you see how everybody is like scrambling for Africa? You should scramble to take these notes, okay?
Exactly, guys.
Just like how
Exactly.
just like how everybody wants Africa, you should want to take these notes so you can pass this class, okay?
Exactly.
And this is Henna and Emily.
Yeah, it is, if you couldn't tell.
yeah,
But you
okay.
can't see Hannah.
Okay, guys, take those notes, okay?
They'll be receiving a special guest star credit. So, it's Scramble for Africa time. So, the Scramble for Africa is this period dating from around 1884 all the way up to basically the First World War. It's considered a time period where the European powers are basically all clashing over African colonies. Now, what's kind of changed between, let's say, previous European colonizations of Africa, like, for example, what you saw with the Portuguese or the Dutch, and the present is the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution has suddenly made resources and commodities relevant that were previously irrelevant. Now, for the Europeans, there's only one problem. And if you said the people who are already living in these regions, well, that is incorrect, sadly. No, the issue is that there's this worry that this scramble for additional colonies might precipitate a general conflict. Prussian, later German statesman Otto von Bismarck had just finished putting Germany back together after a series of very successful but incredibly divisive and controversial wars, and to be honest, he really didn't want another general war on the horizon, especially not with France and Russia. So what he tries to do is he tries to establish some kind of diplomatic protocol and understanding for the partitioning of Africa between Belgium, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. Now, of course, in this partition, it would be, of course, nice to get the consent of the native people, but if that's your thought process, you're dead wrong. The Europeans did not invite any African representatives to actually participate in the conference whatsoever. The Berlin Conference, or Congo Conference as it was called, also represents the great European fascination for settling problems by drawing lines on a map rather than actually asking or getting to know the people who live behind those lines on maps. So a lot of these territorial divisions are being made without concern for the ethnic or cultural groups. So traditional African communities are disrupted. Also, one other consequence is that it sometimes puts rival groups, rival cultures in the same territorial unit. So this is, to use the diplomatic vernacular of the time period, a hot mess. So here's Africa in 1880, and one thing that you'll notice is that oftentimes native peoples actually control their own countries or provinces or states or whatever we want to call them by 1913. So basically on the eve of the First World War, Africa looks like this. So Britain basically gets West Africa, Belgium gets the Congo, more on that later. The French are in northwestern Africa, and South Africa is already claimed by the British. There are a number of other smaller European colonies and possessions, like you got the Germans in here for some reason. Silly Kaiser Wilhelm. The exception, though, is that well, by 1900, basically all of Africa gets colonized except for two independent states. We have Ethiopia right here, and we've got Liberia right there. Now, the Ethiopians were actually pretty bad you-know-whats because they actually fought Italy and defeated them um, in on basically two separate occasions, I believe. So again, what's prompting this renewed scramble for Africa? Well, to a certain extent, it's just nationalism, and what makes your nation feel better than painting the world more in its own colors? I wish I was exaggerating, but that is literally the sentiments of a number of individuals we'll talk about, most notably Cecil Rhodes. But more specifically, the development of industrial technology has revolutionized the strategic importance of certain resources. So, for example, you have the ability to extract and vulcanize rubber now, which is important for the bicycle industry and eventually the automotive and airplane industry. Um, Also, the technological capacity to actually go into what was called the dark heart of Africa. has increased significantly. So you have the development of steamships. Also, you have knowledge of rivers like the Nile, Niger, Congo, and Zambezi River that rivers that Europeans use to their advantage. So what's the stuff that they're there for? Whoops. They are there for, among other things, um, diamonds, gold, and copper in Central and Southern Africa, and eventually rubber in places like Belgian Congo. So with that in mind, let's turn our attention to the Congo. So the Belgian monarchy, as we will find out, basically turns the Congo into hell on earth. It becomes essentially a forced labor camp, and it might be one of the first examples of modern genocide. In fact, the term crime against humanity is first used in connection with what happens in Belgian Congo. So first off, we have to explain this bizarre story of why Belgium. I mean, Belgium has only been in existence for, at this time period, roughly under 60 years. So how does little Belgium come into possession of a country many times larger than it? And the answer is this guy, King Leopold II. King Leopold II sends explorer Henry Morton Stanley to basically stake a personal claim on the territory of the Congo, and he doesn't want Belgium to have it. He wants to have it personally. So to explain what is hopefully an obvious difference, if the government of the United States taxes you, that means that the taxes go to the United States government and Congress basically appropriates the money and spends it however it sees fit. If the president of the United States is taxing you, even though that's totes unconstitutional, well then that money is going into the president's bank account and he's eating at Olive Garden every night. Leopold's claim to Belgium basically consists of two of the following elements. One is, I found it first. Two is that he's bringing civilization and Christianity to Africa. To be honest, he doesn't. In fact, he does just the opposite. He brings instead a force of mercenaries called Force Publique, and they then set about basically enslaving the native Congolese people, and they force them to work on things like rubber plantations. So by the mid-1890s, rubber becomes by far the colony's most profitable industry, and if we look at what's going on around the time period, this is when the bicycle craze is reaching its peak, but also the demand for rubber is not going to go anywhere. You're going to see the emergence of the American auto industry and, of course, the worldwide auto industry, which, of course, requires rubber tires. So there are going to be other sort of tycoons and global celebrities, like, for example, Henry Ford, who will buy large tracts of land in Brazil for precisely this same goal. Even by the standards of European imperialism, which was always pretty bloodthirsty, even at the best of times, Belgium and King Leopold truly stood out from the rest. The native Congolese are reduced to the status of serfs, and I would even go so far as to argue that they were reduced to the status of slaves. And between 1885 to 1908, the native Congolese population decreases by about 10 million people. This is done through murder, starvation, disease, exhaustion, and, of course, just plummeting birth rates, because who would want to bring a child that they would love into that kind of environment? Suffice to say that King Leopold II doesn't have the best historical reputation. And in fact, if you want a recipe for some nightmares, go pick up the book King Leopold's Ghost, which is a history of, King Leopold's colonial presence in Congo. It's absolutely horrible. Moving on to a slightly less gut-wrenching topic, we return to the Boers. Previously on AP World History, we talked about the establishment of Cape Colony by the Dutch in 1652. So this colony was mostly populated by Dutch farmers called Boers. Boer in the Dutch language is it basically means farmer, but it also kind of means like a redneck or country bumpkin at the same time. So not really used as a compliment. So slowly but surely, as the Boer population increases, they move to the interior and away from the coastline. So in what is called the Great Trek in 1834, the Boers migrated further into the interior of South Africa, and it's around that time period that they encounter other African peoples like the Zulu. More on them in just a second. So that expansion causes a little bit of conflict with surrounding African states, and it also leads to the Boers enslaving indigenous peoples like the Khoikhoi and the San. So in addition to coerced labor, these enslaved people could also experience sexual violence at the hands of their Boer captors and being placed upon reservations that they could not leave. So the Boers, we also have to remember, they settled Cape Colony before the Scientific Revolution and before the Enlightenment. So this has been a very isolated group of European colonists. Just to give you an idea, the Boers have been there longer than Pennsylvania and South Carolina have existed as British colonies. So yeah, they've been there for a while. And just like these other American colonies, they have sort of an independent streak. Now, in 1795, the British actually take over Cape Colony from the Dutch. Now, that being said, even though there's no love lost between the British and the Boer population, more or less the British are content to let the Boers basically do their own thing at first, partially because the British really have one specific interest in Cape Colony, and that's basically to use it as a pit stop and coaling station on the way to India. But that harmonious relationship, or let's say lack of conflict in the relationship between the British and the Boers, that is not going to last forever. Newton's third law of motion states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Well, for the Boers and their Great Trek, that opposite reaction came in the form of Shaka Zulu. Shaka Zulu is the leader of the Zulu kingdom, and basically he creates this militaristic kingdom that's not all that dissimilar from Sparta, the idea of a nation being perpetually ready for war. In 1818, he begins the process of African unification. The idea is to conquer nearby tribes so that they can be unified and form a common response against the Boers and the British. Owen, yes, Owen, Shaka Zulu is basically the IRL version of Caesar from Fallout New Vegas. Shaka Zulu and his armies come up with what's called the Impi Spear. This is a spear that's kind of on the shorter side that can both be used as a stabbing weapon and as a throwing weapon, and this gave the Zulu armies a significant advantage over their opponents. The other big advantage that the Zulus had is, if you notice, they're not wearing lots and lots of armor or anything like that. Instead, what their advantage was in their speed and mobility. So I couldn't find any pictures of this, but basically, if you look at a Zulu warrior's foot, the skin is just entirely calloused over. Like, you could almost peel the calluses off. And this was because they were trained at a very early age to run a huge number of miles per day. And so basically they could outmarch their opponents and outmaneuver them on the battlefield. Now, Shaka Zulu ends up being killed by relatives in 1828, so he only rules for a little over 10 years. But the unification process does result in this period of extreme chaos. So it's called the Mfecane period. My pronunciation here is very dubious. This sort of period of civil war and chaos actually leads to about 1 to 2 million deaths. So you can see that on the one hand, Shaka Zulu is not the kind of guy to be Mahatma Gandhi. Like, he's not going to pull the whole civil disobedience thing. He views the British and the Boers as colonizers, and he is going to fight them. But doing so definitely has a cost. In this case, 1 to 2 million people. Also, it ends up displacing groups like the Sotho, the Nguni, and the Shoshigane. So lots of collateral damage here. Eventually, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, you do get a fight between the British and the Zulu in 1879. And actually, the Zulu end up winning a very significant battle against the British, the Battle of Zandawana. But ultimately, even though they win a few battles, one, the battles that they win are very costly, two, it's ultimately not enough. Remember that the relationship between the British and the Boers was marked by sort of a mutual apathy or disinterest, punctuated by periods of suspicion. The Boers are not the American colonists. Like there aren't these daddy issues that they have with the mother country. Actually, I'm not. I don't think you can really have daddy issues with a mother. Whatever. But the Boers, the Boer colonies, and there are two republics, by the way. There's the Orange Free State and Transvaal in the interior. The British really didn't care about them because, again, remember that Cape Colony was primarily a place for British ships to basically stop over on their way to India. So the other thing that kind of made Cape Colony seeming to be increasingly like obsolete was the opening of the Suez Canal. So basically, instead of British ships going all the way around the Horn of Africa, they basically just go through Egypt and the Red Sea, and they come out in the Indian Ocean. Saves thousands of miles. So that was the case until a British businessman named Cecil Rhodes discovers diamonds in the Orange Free State. And then in 1885, gold was discovered in Transvaal. Rhodes at first is more interested in infrastructure and wants to basically build a rail line from Cairo to the Cape. Railroad and telegraph line, more specifically. And Cecil Rhodes wants to annex the Orange Free State and Transvaal. In fact, he says that he would annex the stars if he could, but acknowledges there are certain sort of legal limitations. But as you can kind of imagine, with the discovery of diamonds and gold, the number of British immigrants to the Cape skyrockets. Cecil Rhodes founds De Beers Diamond Company, which becomes the largest diamond mining company on Earth, and a good chunk of the South African economy, even today, still revolves around mining both gold and diamonds. Because of the large influx of British immigrants, and because it seems like the British government is more intent on interfering in the internal affairs of the Orange Free State and Transvaal, these Boer republics basically declare that the British have invaded them, and so they declare war in 1899, starting what is called the Boer War. Boers pretty quickly realize that they can't stand up to the British in an open battle. So what they do is they use guerrilla tactics, where they basically snipe and ambush the British in the terrain of South Africa, which was called the Veldt. It turns out that the Boers are not very good battlefield troops, but as guerrillas, they excel. They excelled at sort of almost riding in like cowboys, dismounting, firing at the British, and then retreating. They were also aided by a gleeful German emperor / Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who used this opportunity to arm the Boer insurgents against the British government. Win the war, the British basically face the same challenge that they did in the American Revolution, which is you're not just fighting an enemy army, you're fighting an enemy idea, which is the desire to be independent. Now, the British, you can argue, actually react much more harshly in the Boer War than they ever did in the American War of Independence. the evidence we have for this is that after a series of British defeats, the British basically reorganize their war effort. They start winning battles, but the other thing that they do is they start herding the Boer civilian population into camps. They're concentrating large numbers of people in one camp location. In other words, these are concentration camps. Now, to be clear, we have to define what a concentration camp actually is. So our image of a concentration camp is going to eternally be defined by the Holocaust, as it should be. So in the Holocaust, you had concentration camps that are later used as death camps. Most concentration camps are not used for the extermination of the population therein. In fact, that's kind of what made the Holocaust so abhorrent, is the extra mile that the Germans went to. Most concentration camps around this time and afterwards were places of forced labor, and we generally associate them as being places where civilian populations are being concentrated, and it's using extrajudicial methods for doing so. So in other words, a prisoner who has been, a convict who has been arrested and tried and sent to a prison camp, that's not a concentration camp, right? Because there's some kind of legal due process involved. Now, again, the British aren't trying to exterminate the Boer population, but you get large numbers of people in one place at one time, and you start to have problems relating to sanitation and disease. Also, the British didn't do a very good job of catering for the Boer population, so something like 14 to 20,000 people die in these camps. But as painful as it is to say after that display, by 1902 the British do unite all the republics into the Union of South Africa, and with that the vast majority of the African population, save for Ethiopia and Liberia, is under European control.